this moment, for this very special moment. And I'm tickled to death for two reasons. First of all, to be invited to such a wonderful and well-respected gathering as this by a group, Angela, which has distinguished itself as being among one of our nation's finest, not just women's organizations, but organizations, period. Very humbling experience. The second reason is personal. Personal because I know the man. I know his ministry. I know his family. I have been privileged to labor with him in our Zion, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a church that in a few months will convene its 50th quadrennial session in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, celebrating 200 years of service to humanity. A church where our speaker's father sits as senior bishop. But on to the task of today. I was intrigued by Life magazine's December edition, 100 people who changed the world. I was intrigued by the magazine's title, People That Changed the World. I found that title intriguing because we live in a society where so often the opposite happens. The world changes us. What we've accomplished in the world, what we've been able to possess in the world, what we have power over in the world, who we are in the world, changes us. But somehow these men, these women, they were able to pull the world toward them. Now, as a result of their commitment, they were ostracized, beaten, killed, murdered. But somehow through all of that, they made a difference in the world. If the events in the last couple of weeks are any indication of where destiny may lead our speaker, I would merely say to him, Dr. Bryant, when you get there, you'll be in good company. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Jamal Bryant.
great Mahalia Jackson with an incredible and extraordinary day in Washington that is still with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. From Baltimore, Maryland, Reverend Dr. Jamal Bryant.
Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. Nobody said the road was going to be easy, but I don't believe he's brought us this far just to leave us now. In all of my days, I never dreamed or imagined I'd be able to say that I preached after Mahalia Jackson sang. So this is, in fact, a historical moment for me. I'm appreciative for the incredible women of the National Council of Negro Women. Mary McLeod Bethune birthday legacy, after being an advisor to the president, saying that if black women ever harness their power, they will be able to change a nation. She passed that baton over to Dr. Dorothy Height, and how history ought to be standing on tiptoe anticipation, knowing that Angela Wilson is carrying on an incredible legacy of what it means to be young, gifted, and black. Would you help me overwhelmingly appreciate our president? It was said by the late wife of Dr. Joseph Lowry that in the civil rights movement, all of the men were on the front line because all the women were doing the real work. As my mother is a womanist theologian, as I look at this roster, I would be in terrible trouble with all these men standing on the rostrum and at the head table. Let me ask all of the women in the house, would you just wave your hand? We owe you a debt of gratitude. Let's salute and celebrate. We live in an hour where people would rather be comforted by a lie than be challenged by the truth. As a consequence, I am eternally indebted to the churches of this community for your forthright prayers and for your continued support in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our job is not to adjust to culture, but to really speak to culture. It is not my role today to be a point of a division, but as a point of unity. Not to speak against any community, but to speak to the advancement of black people in America in this hour. So let me say to the National Council of Negro Women, I apologize for putting you in a position of having to defend the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was not my intention or my task to speak on anything related to a matter relative to a sermon I preached in 2012, but to speak to the state of injustice of black America in 2016. And so thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your support. The St. Petersburg Tampa family, you have overwhelmed me with your prayers and Instagram, Twitter messages over the last 3 weeks. I rolled over one morning and I didn't know what had happened. I said, wow, I didn't know I pastored in St. Petersburg, but I'm grateful and I'm glad. Author of some 57 literary works, having survived 3 concentration camps, Eli Wiesel once said that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And it is amazing that when you gauge the pulse of what is taking place with the perplexities of African American people, that you are finding hate masked as indifference. Then nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to care that 13 black women were raped by a police officer in Oklahoma. And as a consequence, it wasn't leading on MSNBC or on Fox. There's an overwhelming indifference when a woman will in fact be snatched out of the hospital and die after it was obvious she needed care. There's an indifference when a musician finds himself in West Palm Beach, killed, and still we find no justice. And I wonder whether or not we have lost our emotion, lost our temperament, and lost our backbone when we refuse to care. There was a writer out of antiquity, a Greek poet, that wrote the poem If. And in that poem, If, he says, in no uncertain words, without ever biting his tongue, if you do not love ugliness, you'll never be able to love its victims. Because when it comes to the victims, you can't choose the pose on how they die. And so many people have a high hand, but have a low tolerance for people who suffer. Because suffering makes you look at the inner core of who it is that you are and the measure of what it is that you believe. One of the pivotal theological statements of Dr. King was that I have decided to stick with love because hate is too great a burden. It's amazing that many people didn't understand what Kanye West said after the hurricane hit New Orleans and absolutely ravaged an entire city. He said, in no uncertain terms, that George Bush doesn't like black people. He was talking about the indifference. He was talking about the luxury of trying to make the pose of people who are victims. In 1984, a rock group by Foreigner said, I want to know what love is. Tina Turner turned around 2 years later and asked the question, what's love got to do with it? Many of us still haven't found out what that love is and cannot see it measured and cannot see it acted out. After having studied at Morehouse College and Duke University, I could not find a philosopher or even a rhetorician who could absolutely pinpoint for me the demonstration of love. I really didn't see it in our lifetime out of pulling the pages of history apart. The first time I saw love in action was not after working at an orphanage in Haiti, not after digging wells in Africa, not after trying to educate an urban center after an uprising in Baltimore. The very first time that I saw love demonstrated was just a few weeks ago at an airport in Chicago. I was on a layover headed on to another flight, and I stopped in the men's room. And when I stopped in the men's room, there was a man working in the bathroom. And on the sink, he had a bowl of mints. In Dixie cups, he had mouthwash. And in a tin, he had samples of cologne. When I walked into the bathroom, you heard all kinds of strange sounds. You were able to hear all kinds of pungent odors. But there was Mr. Johnson in Chicago's airport, singing, passing out mints, giving out cups of mouthwash, offering people samples of cologne. People were in stalls making all kinds of noises, releasing all kinds of pungent smells. And Mr. Johnson was smiling, passing out mints, small cups of mouthwash, and giving out samples of cologne. People came out of the stall and never washed their hands. And Mr. Johnson was smiling, passing out mints, small Dixie cups of mouthwash, samples of cologne. And I asked Mr. Johnson, have you never seen him, never met him before? Mr. Johnson, why do you do this? He said, sir, the only way I can do it is I have to love people. I know they're full of crap. But the love that I have to exercise is being able to love them knowing what they've done, knowing the stench they've left behind, and knowing sometimes they don't even care to wash their hands. the real reflection of the Christ love that we are to exercise is, can you love people when you know their business? Can you love people when they don't agree with you? Can you love people when they come from a different background, a different ideology, and a different economic station? It is, in fact, unfortunate that last night, while many of us watched the last presidential debate before heading to Iowa and New Hampshire, that large sections of time was dedicated to the middle class, but nothing was said about the poor. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that poverty is the bride of crime, and America has declared war on crime, but doesn't say a word about poverty. I wonder, while it is that we're in this sacred space, while we're enjoying this breakfast, have we given enough care to the poor? To think about even the least of these, those who can't afford a ticket, those who don't wear hats, those who don't have three-piece suits. We say that we love everybody, but do our actions speak louder than our words? It's got to be a season of great discontentment, that there has to be something that you hate, something that you cannot stand. Something that in fact compels you to make a change, to challenge the structure, and to upset the status quo. You ought to in fact understand that hate is a great dislike. It is a seething discontent for something that exists without any reprimand. I don't know how you feel about it, but I absolutely hate where it is that we are as a nation. I hate the fact that there is a disproportionate wedge when we deal with the economy. That we're living in a place and in an hour that 10% run the economy of the other 99. Something ought to upset you by virtue of the fact that the average African American only has $6,000 in their savings account. But right now in this breakfast has on $1,200 worth of clothes. Something ought to upset you. Something ought to upset you to the fact that we don't have enough to retire, so that our parents are working and working and working, and at this hour don't even receive a gold watch. Something ought to upset you. This is the largest generation of black grown people who live with their parents, with no higher trajectory to do more for the generation that comes behind them. Something ought to upset you, that as black people, we are America's leading consumers, but we are the least producers. Something ought to upset you, that we're still in this hour, the last hired and the first fired, and we are hit a concussion trying to break through a glass ceiling. Something ought to upset you, that we have raised a generation of children who have a false sense of entitlement, when they have cell phones but can't conjugate verbs. Something ought to upset you, that somehow or another that we'll spend our last just so that we can look the best, and on the inside we feel like the least. Something ought to upset you when you go to church and all you hear about is tithing, but you hear nothing about a budget. Nothing about how it is that you live after you give. Something ought to upset you that America somehow or another can find $1 billion for the lottery, but will not feed and take care of our veterans. Something ought to upset you. You ought to be upset about the state of education in America. That we spend the most on the military, but not the most on mathematics and science. Something ought to upset you when the dropout rate is rising at record proportions. That our young people are leaving high school in the 11th and 12th grade and don't even know that Bethune-Cookman and Florida A&M are an option. A mine is a terrible thing to waste. Should not be an option. It ought to be a mandate. We were raised in a generation that said, for us, you better not come home with a C on your report card. But now these are graduating with certificates of completion and don't even know how to reduce fractions.
There ought to be a greater gauge for their accomplishment than working a computer at McDonald's. But Florida ought to be raising up engineers and computer scientists and entrepreneurs, and you ought not rest until you raise a black governor for the state of Florida. That ought to be something that accepts you. America owes you, Florida, a debt of gratitude. Thank you so much for delivering Barack Obama to the White House. Florida, if we would have just awakened you earlier, you could have stopped Bush. Can I ask you not to repeat the same mistake twice? Whatever you do, please keep Donald Trump at the casino and let's rebuild an America that will look better for the generations yet to come. You ought to be upset. You ought to be angry that somehow or another Lady Liberty has her blindfold on too tight. That black people are unable to see justice. When the killer of Trayvon Martin is walking free, that ought to upset you. When we find no justice for Sandra Bland, that ought to upset you. When the killer of Michael Brown roams the street free, working in a police uniform, that ought to upset you. When Freddie Gray's family still doesn't have justice, that ought to upset you. For the nameless, faceless young men and women in Florida who are behind bars but can't find the money to get behind a college debt, that ought to upset you. Living in an hour where parents have to take out a second mortgage just for college tuition, that ought to upset you. We're absent of seeing what love looks like when it's modeled and when it's demonstrated. And greater love has no man than this, than a man would lay down his life for his friends. No man takes my life, I lay it down. And if I lay it down, I can pick it back up again. We find Jesus talking to those who called themselves astute in John chapter 10. And he gives us the parable about a man who's walking from Jerusalem to Jericho. And might I tell you that that man already is bound for trouble because he's headed in the wrong direction. Jerusalem is the headquarters for the Holy Ghost. It is the epicenter for the temple. It is, in fact, the Mecca for those who are worshipers of Yahweh. And he's leaving Jerusalem to go to Jericho, the seat of polytheism, a seat of an era that said, it's your thing, do what you want to do. A seat where it is that marriage was handled loosely. And he's walking from Jerusalem to Jericho. And so many of us who have graduated from Vacation Bible School, we're familiar with the narrative that he fell amongst thieves and they beat him. But nobody ever tells us why they beat him. Did they beat him because he had on the latest pair of Jordans? Did they beat him because they were trying to steal his iPhone 6? Or did they beat him because he had a different definition of marriage? Why did they beat him? Nobody gives us the definition. Was he racially profiled? Were the thieves actually police officers? Why did they beat him? Was in fact a public school system that wanted to label him as attention deficit disorder, not realizing that he was actually gifted and talented and needed an unconventional approach to education? Why did they beat him? They beat him and they robbed him and they left him half dead. And isn't that the good news of the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ? Is that if in fact they were going to do him in, they should have killed him. But when you're messing with a child of God, whatever you do, don't leave them half dead. Because if you leave them half dead, they got a 50% chance of getting back on their feet again. And there's some people in this room right trying to leave you half dead, and you got to testify, if it had not been
They left him half dead. And when they left him half dead, you'll notice that the first people that passed him by were Levites, politicians. They saw people beaten, saw people stripped, saw people robbed, saw them in poverty, but said, no, I can't touch him. It's an election year. Politicians passed him by. Said, no, I'm not going to do anything about it. That's not a part of my voting block. No, I'm not going to touch him. He's not in my donor list. And the politicians left this young black boy on the side of the road. If that were not bad enough, right after he was left on the side of the road, the gospel shared with us, a preacher passed him by. God help me, where was the preacher going that he couldn't help somebody who was injured? He said, I can't help him. I'm one of the 100 preachers going to meet with Donald Trump. I can't go meet with a little boy who doesn't have any money. The preacher passed him by. How did you pass him by? The preacher passed him by. Said, I can't do street ministry. I got to run and get on my private jet. I don't have time to reach those who are beaten and left on the side of the road. And here comes a good Samaritan. Somebody who doesn't live in their community. Somebody who is not amongst them. And he picks them up. And the Bible records he pours oil on him. Puts bandages on him. Hear me, and doesn't know him. He doesn't know him, but he expresses the real love of Christ and the testimony of Martin Luther King Jr. He takes him down to Embassy Suites, checks him into the hotel, and says, put all of the charges on me. I know he doesn't know how to do it by himself, but I raise him up so he'll be able to stand up and give Dr. King's speech from Oslo. I know other people will throw him away, but I see value and virtue and future in this boy's life, and so I'll put a tie on him when the rest of America will throw him away. He says, I want to demonstrate what love is by taking care of somebody who's been wounded, somebody who's been beaten, somebody who's been thrown away. That's what Dr. King admonished us to do. Love those who turn on fire hoses. Love those who release barking dogs. Love those who don't call you sir and ma'am. Love those who don't appreciate the quality of your character. Love those who can only see the color of your skin. Our commandment is to love even the least of these. Love your enemies because they don't know they're helping you. Because the Lord says, I prepare a table before you in the presence of your enemies. If you didn't have any enemies, you can't get a table. So you want to thank God for every enemy you have. That's why y'all sold out of tables this morning. We had so many enemies. Love those. We don't believe that you can come anything, knowing that I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. Love those that talk about you. You can talk about me as much as you please, but I talk about you on bended knee. Love those who try to hold up your progress, because you remember they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength and mount up on wings as eagles. Love those who try to shut doors on you, but they don't know if it's not that door, there's another door down the hall. Love those. Oh, Negro spiritual, we don't sing anymore. It says, I want to treat everybody right. You got to love people because you don't know who God is going to use. I graduated from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, graduated from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, but all of that is my New Testament. I failed the 11th grade, got kicked out of high school, had to go get a GED, got into Morehouse on probation, and my high school
school guidance counselor told my parents I wasn't college material. Put me in the military so I can get some discipline. Put me in job corps. Maybe I'll get myself together. But I had a praying mom. They said, you don't know the promise over my child's life. And can I tell you, St. Petersburg, that same guidance counselor that didn't think I was going to be in this thing is now an usher at my church. Because in God is with you, it doesn't matter who's against you. I love you, St. Petersburg. I love you, Tampa. I love you, LGBT community. I love you, protesters. I love you, Mayor, even if you're